Welcome, everybody. My name is Liat Wexler. I am the training specialist at Center for Community Solutions in San Diego. My background is in training as well as partner abuse and sexual assault. I have been doing this work for almost 20 years. And I got my start with an organization in Massachusetts called the network Laverne, which works to end domestic violence in LGBTIQ communities, polyamorous, and kinky communities. And so this is really the topic that I'm most passionate about. And so I look forward to talking specifically about the cultural dynamics of abuse in LGBTQIA plus relationships. And so that's a mouthful, but really I'm talking about the very specific ways that partners might use aspects of these communities to control and manipulate their partners. And so just really briefly, our objectives today are to develop a more nuanced understanding of the culturally specific tactics of power and control that are used in abusive relationships in LGBTQIA plus communities, and the dynamics in these communities that actually create a foundation for that. And hopefully, as a result of all of this, you'll gain a greater awareness to be able to spot and respond to partner abuse when it happens to your queer and transgender clients. It's going to take more than probably just this webinar, more reading, more connection with the communities, but hopefully this will be a good start. So I just wanted to begin by talking about some of those dynamics that happen within these communities. A lot of people aren't aware that even though we have a rainbow flag and there's this acronym that covers the entire alphabet, if you will, in reality, each of these communities is relatively separate. And there's very particular dynamics that happen between them. So for example, on the left, you'll see the two male symbols that represents gay and the two female symbols on the right that represents lesbian. These two communities don't tend to interact all that much. I mean, for political fights and other, efforts happening broadly in the community, sure. But in truth, the needs and desires of each of these two communities is relatively different. And one of the ways that we've seen this showing up is that the lesbian bars all over the country are closing. There essentially are basically no remaining lesbian bars to be seen in any major city. All of them have either become all-inclusive for LGBTQIA folks, or they've just turned into gay bars, or frankly, straight bars. So there's a concern, right, that there aren't community spaces specifically for lesbians, and gay men, are not invested in making sure that there are. So that's one small example. And so one of the things that we see within these communities and between them is a fair bit of sexism and femmephobia. So sexism from gay men towards lesbians and all women, including straight women. And that might include like gay men sexually assaulting straight women by grabbing their breasts, sort of jokingly, because they don't, it's not their primary sexual attraction, and so it becomes an excuse to cause harm. But it's also more explicit or more subtle, depending on the situation. And femmephobia, this is sort of related, but it can happen when people are disdainful of femme presentations or feminine expression in general. And so that can include gay men being disdainful towards other gay men who are more femme presenting. The next community I want to talk a little bit about is the bisexual community. There's also pansexual and queer, but I want to specifically talk about biphobia. And so the flag you see there is the bisexual flag and the symbol as well. The bi community experiences not just biphobia and, all kinds of stigma and negative perceptions from outside, right, from straight people, but also from within. So for example, gay men and lesbians often think that bisexual men and women will, are just on their way to becoming gay or lesbian, that they just haven't gotten off the fence, or that they're confused, or they're scared to fully come out, that they just want to flex, straight passing privilege in some way. And so those are all examples of biphobia. When we talk about the transgender community, here are examples of two prominent transgender people, Laverne and Chaz Bono. And within all, this umbrella, there's a lot of transphobia. So not just from straight and cisgender people, but also from cisgender, lesbian, gay, and bisexual folks who see trans people as being somehow aberrant or not, not aligned, not having the same issues, because it's about gender and it's not about orientation. And so when it comes to relationships between trans folks and people within the LGBT community, it can sometimes be strained. And there may be some transphobia as part of the dynamics of abuse as well. And so that transphobia can manifest, I'll give many specific examples in a little bit, but that transphobia manifests as overt or also very subtle, controlling things like taking away a person's access to health insurance. And that might just seem like a financial abuse strategy, but it might prevent someone from being able to transition. Then we've got people who are in the non-binary or genderqueer communities. And so these are some examples of some prominent non-binary individuals. You'll see the actor Asia Kate Dillon from Billions, Amandla, Cara Delevingne, like Jacob Tobiah, and Alok. A whole bunch of people who are non-binary, and so that community is becoming more and more visible, which is really important. And at the same time, we see a dynamic of binarism, which is bias against people who are not binary, and specifically sort of prioritizing or implying that people who are binary gendered, so men or women, including trans people who are men and women, are somehow superior, are more real than non-binary people, more trans than non-binary people. So that dynamic happens within the trans community and the trans umbrella as well. And I also really want to mention the intersex community. So intersex folks can come in all shapes and stripes. Some intersex people are also transgender. Some intersex people are not, and identify with whatever sex they were actually assigned at birth. And some intersex people are members of a sexual minority, so LGBTQ in some way, while others are not. Some are straight. And so there are many intersex people who would say, I don't fall under the LGBTQIA plus umbrella. However, there are some who do, so I include that in the acronym. But there's a fair amount of intersex stigma from within the community, a lack of awareness, certainly, and what's called dyadism. So when you think dyad, it means two. And so it refers to people who are born falling clearly into one of the sex binaries of male or female, as opposed to intersex. So, the preferential bias towards people who are not intersex. So here we have a power and control wheel that I've developed that's based on the original one from Duluth, Minnesota, as well as the work of Rowe and Jagodinsky. I know that it's very small print, but ultimately it follows a very similar pattern to what we've seen in all other power and control wheels. But around the outside, you're going to notice homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia, both internalized as well as institutional. And you'll also see at the bottom cissexism, heterosexism, and binarism. So these dynamics sort of circle all throughout each of the different power and control strategies and tactics that folks within these communities might use against their partners. I want to be very clear that in LGBTQIA plus relationships, people also use the tactics that are used in straight relationships with cisgender people. So all of the same dynamics that exist that we've seen on power and control wheels before also exist here. There are, though, some very culturally specific dynamics that may show up. I'm not saying that they always will, but in some cases, these are avenues that people can use to engage with power. And truly, when we talk about these communities having friction and differences within the umbrella, those things get used as well within relationships. So that gets reflected on the interpersonal level, not just the community level. And so you'll see a whole lot of examples, but I'm going to go through a number of them now with you. So if we look at the financial and economic abuse category, one might be forcing you to live beyond your means because, quote, gay people like nice things. And this is a myth. I mean, this is certainly a cultural norm within the gay community for some people. And folks, partners who are abusive may use this as a strategy to control their partners. So an example might be a partner teasing the survivor about driving an older car and maybe constantly talking about dating attractive men that have a Mercedes. And that subtle dig every single time over the course of a relationship begins to really erode that sense of value and worth in a survivor. Again, we're looking for a pattern of power and control. So one example of any of these tactics might not be a sufficient tool for assessing that there's partner abuse. However, when you start to see a larger pattern within all of these tactics, that's when there's a concern. Another example might be using the lack of employment protections available to most people in the United States in order to keep a partner in an unhealthy work environment or unemployed. And an example of that might be pressuring a trans survivor to accept demeaning work or even engage in sex work by reminding them that they likely wouldn't be hired in any standard job. And that is a reality, even though there are protections, for example, in California, that trans people shouldn't be fired or not hired based on their trans status. The reality is that it still happens a lot. And a partner can use that reality as a way to engage in economic abuse. Another example might be stealing a partner's identity or pretending to be a partner in order to access money, credit cards, medical or school records. So an example of this, and the truth is, you know, when medical or school institutions or financial institutions set up their systems, they often don't consider that somebody would be in a same-sex relationship. And so they have protections for if a husband calls trying to get his wife's information, but if somebody calls who has a similar voice, both higher pitch, for example, to the survivor, then they can sometimes convince that institution, that office, to release records that they really shouldn't be releasing. And so the example here is a lesbian partner convincing a doctor's office to release medical information, but that could happen in many different settings. Another example would be controlling the purchase of hormones, clothing, especially highly gendered clothing, prosthetics or makeup. And this is something that partners might use against trans people in particular, or those who enjoy doing drag. So the example here is a straight partner actually cutting up a trans survivor's binder. And a binder is something that is used to compress the chest to make the appearance be flatter and more masculine. So either not allowing a survivor to buy binders, or certainly once they're bought, destroying them, is a tactic of control, both a physical abuse tactic as well as a financial one. Let's talk a little bit about sexual abuse. In this community, sexual abuse, of course, happens in many of the same ways. There's rape and sexual assault and coercive sex of all types. But we also find some very specific dynamics. For example, using terms for survivors' genitals that they find offensive. This can happen regardless of whether you fall into these communities or not. However, if you refer to a trans woman's genitals as her penis, for example, rather than suggesting that you want to lick her clit, or a more neutral term like going down on you, that can be not only offensive, you know, on a kind of core level, just anybody might find it offensive to use certain language, but for a trans woman, referring to her body in this particular way also demeans her gender and her sense of identity, and so it's sort of a double whammy. Another example might be the idea of gold star status. And so there's a sort of an internal joke in the gay and lesbian community of being a gold star gay, which means that you've never had sexual contact with someone of a different gender than you. So a lesbian's never touched a penis before, a gay man has never interacted with a vulva before. And so an abusive partner who's gay or lesbian might joke around that the person they're in a relationship who's bisexual is tainted because they actually have had sex with someone of a different gender. PrEP is a medication that's used to prevent HIV infection. And it's actually incredibly effective, 99% effective. But there are people within the gay community who will slut shame folks who use PrEP. It's sort of implied that by using PrEP, you want to just have more sex freely, or that you're taking PrEP so that you don't have to use condoms. So an example of this might be a gay partner accusing the survivor of cheating because they take PrEP in order to prevent an HIV infection with that current partner, but saying that, you're taking PrEP so that you can just go and sleep around, right? And the implication is, if you really loved me, you would risk getting infected with HIV. You would not be taking PrEP. Another example might be forcing a partner to have sex as the wrong gender. So for example, a cisgender gay partner insisting on vaginally penetrating a survivor who's actually a transgender man. Or on the flip side, maybe a cis straight partner pressuring a survivor who is a trans woman to use her genitals in order to penetrate her. So in many, many cases this can happen, but essentially engaging in sex in a way with your body that doesn't match the way you want to use your body sexually. So let's take a look at emotional power and control tactics. An example might be a straight partner telling a bi survivor, "Why do you need to go to Pride?" The implication is that if you're with a straight partner and you're in a quote opposite sex relationship, of course that's a little meaningless because there's not just two sexes, but the idea being that a straight partner is saying, if you're with me, then you're actually straight. You don't need to go to Pride, or that's not your real community in some way, that your identity actually isn't its own important aspect of your sense of self. Another example might be a lesbian partner laughing at a bi survivor in front of friends and joking that if she can't turn you gay, she isn't a very good lesbian, which plays off of the biphobic myth that bi people are just on the fence or on their way to becoming gay, and that they just are too confused or too reticent to go all the way. Another example might be a partner telling an asexual survivor that they're just damaged from childhood sexual abuse and that they need therapy. When in reality, folks who are asexual, typically it is not related to previous trauma. It's just a form of orientation, sexual orientation, that they do not want to have sex. And this, again, can happen with partners who are straight, who are part of the LGBTIQ communities. Anybody could be telling an asexual survivor that. We have a binary trans partner, so someone who's either a trans man or a trans woman, saying, so you're one of those trans trenders who make it hard for real trans people to get what they need from doctors. For example, to a non-binary partner. The term transgender is derogatory, and it implies that someone is just doing it to be trendy, to be kind of cool with their friends, and that real trans people are actually binary, that they're either men or women, and that people who are non-binary are confused or aren't real. A final example might be a partner introducing a non-binary person to new people with the wrong gender, name, or pronouns. So for example, saying, this is my girlfriend, Jillian, and she's, whatever. And when in reality, this person may not use the term girlfriend, that's a gendered word, may no longer use the name Jillian or the pronouns she. And so that would be really, really disheartening, I think, to hear repeatedly from a partner, especially after they already know that you're non-binary. So denying, blaming, and minimizing, an important chunk of the wheel. An example here is saying that it's not abuse, that they're just angry over their partner's transition. So for example, that might come out as, I'm just having a hard time with you transitioning because I fell in love with a man and I feel like you're pulling out the rug from under me. So, the truth is that many people who are cisgender do have a hard time when their partners come out as transgender. However, that's no excuse for abusing a partner, or for manipulating them, or for shaming them, and minimizing what actually is abuse by calling it, anger or distress, or, essentially turning the blame around on that partner. Another example might be claiming that LGBTQIA plus people can't be abusers. So this is an old myth, of course, and I hope nobody still believes this, but within the community, people do say things like this. We're both women, so there's no power dynamic here. It can't be abuse. There's the idea that airing dirty laundry will hurt the fight for civil rights. And so while we've made some progress with institutional rights, it doesn't mean that those aren't at risk. And those are things that we're currently seeing from the administration, and we're currently seeing around the country as civil rights do get eroded again. And so that may, sort of surface as a partner saying to another, if you tell anyone about this, people will think that gay people shouldn't have gotten equal marriage. So sort of the idea that speaking up actually makes us all look bad. A final example here, forcing a partner to change their orientation in order to align with their gender identity. We don't often think of trans people as being abusive, but it does happen. And so here's an example, a trans man telling a lesbian partner that when he transitions, she will need to change her identity to bisexual, because remaining a lesbian would erase his gender. It would make him invisible within the relationship, right? Because a lesbian's attracted to women, of course, and he's a man. So again, we can't control another partner's identity. That's certainly a conversation to have over time with a partner, but demanding or requiring that rather than talking about your own feelings about erasure are tactics that can be part of an abusive dynamic. The use of children within these communities is specifically, it's in many ways different because issues around custody and threat from courts is very, very real for folks within the umbrella. So an example might be pressuring a partner against their will to impregnate or to get pregnant. And so that may look like a cisgender partner forcing a trans woman to impregnate her. Some trans women are still fertile. Some trans women don't take estrogen, don't take hormone blockers, testosterone blockers. And so they can still impregnate, but may not want to. That may be very uncomfortable or humiliating. Another example might even be mocking a partner's infertility. So an intersex person, not all intersex people are infertile, but some people may be. So shaming an intersex survivor's lack of a uterus and blaming their inability to get pregnant maybe for problems in the relationship. So that might be an example of the type of dynamic that happens over time. Another example might be threatening to take away or not allow contact with the children. So saying, I'm the only biological parent, and if you say anything, you'll never see the kids again. That's a huge threat. A lot of people will do anything to stay in their children's lives. And the risk of, not being a biological parent still has a heavy weight in our country. And then finally, another example might be threatening to out partner to child welfare services. So that might show up like a straight partner telling a trans survivor that if he reports the abuse, she'll tell CWS that he's transgender and they'll think he's sick and crazy. And that really relies on an old stigma of trans people being insane because it was listed in the DSM as a disorder. So, many people still believe those things, and that can be used against a survivor. I want to talk a little bit about identity abuse. This overlaps with all the other categories, but I just wanted to give a few more examples. So ridiculing, shaming a partner's flamboyant expression, shaming their body, their HIV status, how femme or butch they are, or their size, their fatness, is something that does happen within the community. As accepting as it is in many ways, there's still a lot of identity dynamics that occur. And an example might be a butch gay partner to their femme partner who's a man. Why do you need to be so extra? Can't you just tone it down a little? there's in fact a fair bit of femmephobia within the gay men's community. And I've heard many femme-presenting gay men express feeling really sidelined by the community because their masculinity is being questioned and challenged and derided. Telling a trans survivor, you're not a real man, you're not a real woman. And that can, again, happen from straight partners, cisgender partners, as well as queer cisgender folks, or even other trans folks. I mean, that has happened, right? I'm more real than you are. And so creating a hierarchy there because I take hormones, let's say, and you don't. And that makes me, really a man and you not. Reinforcing internalized homophobia, biphobia, queerphobia, and transphobia. For many people within our umbrella communities, these things are not escapable, right? We live within a culture that creates those oppressions, and we do internalize them. And so any message, and this is really broad, any message that reinforces those can really put someone back and create a dynamic of abuse as well. We can weave in all types of other identity aspects. So shaming someone's spirituality, because the idea that, all religious institutions reject LGBTQIA plus people is not true, but it's a message that some people in the community believe. And so not letting a partner attend spiritual gatherings or shaming them for doing so, or mocking them for doing so might be a strategy that someone uses. Using just broadly straight passing privilege or cis passing privilege, which means a trans person who looks more cisgender than another trans person. The privilege of being lesbian or gay versus being bisexual or trans or intersex or queer. Or having binary privilege, so having a gender that is binary instead of one that's not, and of course femmephobia. So kind of using that within any other strategy that falls under the wheel can be an aspect of identity abuse. And I also really want to point out racism. I mean, of course, there's all the other isms, but there's a very particular dynamic of racism in, for example, the gay men's community. And you'll see it on dating sites and apps, trying to remember all the names. There's, Adam to Adam and not Tinder. What is it? I don't go on any of the apps. But all of them, allow you to select the folks that you're interested in. And so one of the things that you may see is people saying no blacks, no femmes, no Asians, that sort of thing. Or conversely, it sounds good, but it's tokenizing when you expect black men to have, a large penis. For example, the pressure in the gay men's community for black men to perform sexually in a particular way, or for Asian men to be bottoms. And certainly even within, queer women's communities, an expectation that Latinas will somehow be more femme and wear lipstick and heels and all like that. So we see racist dynamics play out within LGBTIQ plus communities as well. And it's not somehow exempt. I want to talk a little bit just about next steps, which is just to deepen your awareness of things like coded and culturally specific language. So there are some that are on that power and control wheel that you can take a look at. Coded language like, are you family? Which is someone asking, are you part of this community? Bareback sex, poppers, gold star gay prep, all terms that you may not ever hear in straight cisgender communities, but are very, very common within these sub-communities. Being really aware of those internal political divisions, understanding that gay marriage, for example, was really pushed by primarily white gay men, and that other communities, bisexual communities, queer and trans communities, really wanted to pursue other political and civil rights first before marriage, but didn't win and really got thrown under the bus. The dynamics that we've talked about so far of biphobia and transphobia, binarism, femmephobia and fatphobia. So really deepening your understanding of those, and then understanding the internalized and institutional oppressions that exist, and staying up to date on the way the civil rights efforts are going and how those might be used within relationships. So that sums up my webinar for today. I really look forward to hearing your questions and talking with you all live coming up. Thank you all.